Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Chaos to Calm. This is a mid month mental health check in that we do for project management professionals. And thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Michelle Beatty. I'm a project and program manager, and I'm also a mental health advocate.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Carmel Dorsenville. I am a licensed clinical social worker in Florida, Nevada, and in California. Thank you so much, Michelle, for being here tonight. We've had a couple challenges to get here, but we're here.
We are here and ready to serve. So, just to be accountable to our audience, we did not have our mid month check in as planned for December 2024. Life had us on our toes, and despite the attempts of reschedule to keep our commitment, it just did not happen. But we're here with you, and we're happy to be with you and grateful to be with you here in 2025. So, happy New Year, happy 2025. And we are just excited for this opportunity to check in with you about your mental health and, share some insights, some strategies, some tactics, some conversations, some food for thought, some gems of mental wellness with you.
Definitely, definitely. Um, so I don't know, Michelle, do you want to get started?
Yeah, let's get started. So this month, the focus is psychological safety and on how to build healthy teams. And a lot of us, we're easing into the new year, right? Like a lot of things are happening and we're just easing in, and some of us are choosing to make it a soft entry instead of like here I am, and some are like I'm ready, gloves on, they're fighting, they're duking to make sure that they maximize everything. So since we're dealing with a hybrid of different personalities and intentions, we just felt psychological safety would be a great thing to discuss for January. So Val, how do you define psychological safety in the workplace and what makes it essential for mental wellness?
Um, so when I'm working with patients, right, and this is just naturally the way that I conceptualize them, I try to bring it into something that feels rather than this broad concept of psychological safety, like to make it concrete and realistic, right? So let's compare it to if we're talking about a restaurant. You go to the restaurant, you, clearly you're going there for your food, but the experience of what you get is just not about your food, right? It has everything to do with all of the other pieces that come together that give you the entire sense of the experience. And so that's similar to when we're talking about psychological safety. It's more than just the conversations or how you interact with your manager. It's about all of the different elements that create your sense of comfort and confidence in that space. We're talking about the sense of safety that you get when you are in an environment that allows you to share, be curious, ask questions, make mistakes, and know that you're still going to be valued, you're still going to be respected, and you're still going to be supported. For me, those are the tenets of what psychological safety in a professional space ultimately looks like. So for me, I've definitely worked in some spaces that had those and worked in some spaces that did not. But for you as a project manager, like, have you worked in spaces where you felt completely safe to speak up, and ultimately what did, and when you were not, and how did those environments differ for you?
I too definitely have experienced both. And I thrive better in an environment that promotes psychological safety, that allows you to be human and encourages you to be seen in every aspect. If you're having a challenging day, to be able to say, take a breath, maybe reschedule a meeting if need to, feeling comfortable to ask for help, I think is really
That's huge.
big, right? When in a psychological safety environment, asking for help, realizing that you can make a mistake and you're not going to be embarrassed or scolded about it. Instead, the team leadership, they rally around you to help you resolve the issue, shine light on the areas that need help, as far as knowledge gaps or, a redo or whatever that is, and not make you feel as if you're incompetent. I
Yeah.
think it's really critical to someone staying in a role long term. Someone it also helps build loyalty, right?
Absolutely.
Loyalty is a piece, and just overall peace of mind. Like when you go into your work environment, you know that you're going to be respected, even if you're going through ebbs and flows of adjustment. That respect of you as a person, as a respected professional for what you do is still there because you were hired for a reason. And
Absolutely.
some days are good, some days are, lessons in the making. So, yes.
Yeah. I feel like that's do you remember maybe a couple months back when the whole concept of like people were quiet quitting? Do you remember that?
Yes.
That became like a whole thing. And I think that people quiet quitting is the results of being in spaces where they didn't feel psychologically safe,
I can
right?
see that.
Right? When people didn't feel like they were able to speak up and advocate for themselves and feel like they're going to be heard and solutions would follow and not be and there not be repercussions for advocating for themselves. So I think that um, as you were just kind of describing that, that's the first thing that came into mind of, the and when you mentioned loyalty, right? Being able to feel like this is a place I want to continue to pour my talents and my time into. So
So, to piggyback a little bit more on quiet quitting, how does the lack of psychological safety manifest in terms of a team dynamic or an individual well-being?
yeah, I mean, quiet quitting definitely falls in line with that, right? Just kind of people beginning to detach, disengage, go through the motions. But there is really no drive, no energy, no willingness to be innovative and put forth actual energy and passion behind their work, right? Um, Also looks like more disagreements, right? There can oftentimes be a lot of irritability that can stem from people being in spaces where they feel like they are high stress, um, their needs aren't being met, and naturally, right, people makes people cranky. And oftentimes when that increased level of irritability comes into play, that can really look like tension in the workplace and people
Mhm.
not really addressing those conflicts head on, but rather, we're avoiding them, and then resentment builds, and it just kind of comes into what kind of slowly begins to kind of snowball into like one drop, and then it ripples out into multiple ways. So when you're looking at the individuals, you're looking at people who are really not dialed in, not putting in the same level of work and focus, and the caliber of excellence maybe is beginning to start to drop and fade. Because that's part of the quiet quitting. I'm not putting in any effort, real energy or effort behind what I'm doing. I'm just gonna dot this dot this I, across this T. Okay, it's off my list. But in terms of team dynamics, you can really begin to see a breakdown of those team dynamics when people are not showing up fully as themselves, and being able to have the mental and emotional bandwidth to have hard conversations and address challenges head on, right? Um, for you, do you see like in that context, right, when we're looking at how the team dynamics and the individual's well-being begin to play, in what ways do you feel like that psychological safety ultimately impacts maybe like team performance or even the outcomes of the project of them in and of themselves?
I would just say total team engagement, right? Just engaging with the team in conversations when you're in team meetings or you're in stand-ups, just being present, right? Camera on versus camera off. People are asking questions. Are you answering? Are you yes, no, I'll get back to you? Are your answers short or do you elaborate? Sometimes people are reluctant to share their authentic thoughts, not sure what might come back from them giving the unpopular opinion that they
Mhm.
might feel is in the best interest of the project or the program, but they know that their peers or some of the stakeholders, might disagree, because as a project and program manager, we're not the decision makers, but it is our responsibility to shine the light on different areas that need to be shined, to make sure that the questions are being asked. And sometimes that's not the case, but when demonstrating courage, that also piggybacks, or it skips right along with psychological safety, right? And
Yeah.
in my opinion, it does give you that. So I would say just making sure that you feel comfortable to speak up. So it could actually, and if you're speaking up, which is expected of you as a project or program manager, but just also positioning you to thrive, right? Thrive because that's what's expected, but it's how you thrive. What does that look like without feeling like you're caged?
Yeah. I think in addition to that, when you mentioned, excuse me, and how you thrive, I think that that's something that a lot of people are beginning to really be more intentional about. Um, sorry, I'm going to take a sip of water.
Sure.
Been fighting off and on colds for the past month. So when we're talking about um, being able to determine how are you thriving, it's important, because what are the elements that people are looking for in order to identify that they're thriving? And sometimes in order for them to do that, is that meeting deadlines and kind of like pushing beyond their limits, that ultimately is going to affect their ability to show up and affect their ability to engage in conversations and be able to fully be present. So those one word answers and kind of gradual disengagement, they may not recognize how those signs are ultimately pulling away from their overall sense of feeling how they're thriving, where ultimately maybe the outcome came out, but their means to getting to that outcome was less than stellar, right? And so I think that's also a good point that you mentioned. Um, but I think when we're looking at how people are communicating, right, and having these particular breakdowns, I do think there are a couple maybe important like communication strategies that project managers can really kind of utilize to build these emotionally safe environments, right? And the first one I think is lead by example. I know that that's probably one that a lot of people are comfortable with, right? Because it requires for you to share your own challenges, right? And be accountable to those challenges and be transparent about those challenges. But I find that that is probably one of the best ways to create psychological safety in a space. When you feel like the person who, the manager is being able to be transparent about their challenges, it allows you to feel the same. And that is how you open up the door for more meaningful conversation about people wanting to feel more comfortable in being transparent with you, because you're comfortable in sharing your own missteps and your own challenges. So leading by example, being empathetic, right? And I know that that's also like a hot topic word these days, but I think sometimes when people hear empathy, it means they think that means that I need to agree and feel whatever that other person is feeling. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. Empathy is about being able to validate how another person feels. It's about acknowledging how that person feels, but it has nothing to do with agreement, right? I can acknowledge that you feel frustrated about a situation, but I don't necessarily have to agree with maybe your approach to the way that you handled it. So I think those are some good points and some strategies to employ.
Do those same strategies apply to creating a psychological safe environment for yourself during high stress times?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, to be honest, in high stress times, you need more of that rather than less. right? I think we naturally, when we're more stressed, right, we naturally want to go into hyper focus mode and get into task oriented nitty gritty things. But I also think that we need more of that kind of like support and care in the times when things are more stressful rather than
Mhm.
less of it, right? And I don't think that that tends to be our humanistic response. I think we tend to like double down when we're stressed and kind of say, oh, well, we don't really have time for the, the fluff or the extra soft things. But
Yeah.
honestly, that's what you need. You need more rest. You need more time to decompress and process, because that increase in stress level impacts your processing. So things will take you longer for you to get to the point. It takes you longer to kind of put all those ducks in a row that maybe you were able to when the stress level was lower, right? And I think that that's something that we don't necessarily ultimately account for during these high stress times. So it's really more important to create that psychological safety during those times so people can feel comfortable to say, actually, I need a little bit more time with this because I read it and I need to go back through it again, right? Because sometimes it's harder to, retain information and keep things in order. So
Mhm.
I think that I think we need more efforts in that during those high stress times rather than not. Um,
So, Val, how can leaders foster a psychological safety environment? I just want to piggyback on that and to another level and just ask, how can leaders create a psychological safety environment without crossing professional boundaries? Because we all, everyone has a parent, and we don't go to work to be parented, right?
yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes it could potentially come off feeling like parenting or big brother or big sister. For some people might relish in that, but I'm sure there's also a population of people that approach would not. So, is there a baseline that you recommend to help leaders not cross that boundary?
I mean, that's such a good question. And I think it really ultimately goes back to understanding yourself first, right? I think because when you are building these relationships with your team, right, you need to understand how you're showing up, because that's going to create a level of how they're going to respond, right? So for one, when we are talking about, especially in very close knit teams, where I see sometimes the dynamics and the roles often can overlap for multiple different people, I
Mm-hmm.
think there needs to be a lot more clarity between expectations and guidelines, right? We need to know who's doing what and to what level, right? And so I think that as we clarify what everybody's responsibility is, that's part of the first step of really being able to kind of create that psychological safety, because now people have a sense of ownership. And then because you have a sense of ownership, now there's a level of accountability attached to it.
For sure. For sure.
So, yeah. I mean, do you in in for and as a project manager, right? When you're trying to balance out this space of like the urgency of getting deliverables done and the accountability and creating that space, like what does that ultimately look like?
Reminding myself, for me personally, reminding myself to extend myself grace. I like to get stuff done. I am not one that likes to put things off till tomorrow. Like, I'm like, if I have time today, I want to get it done today. I am someone that will schedule an email, schedule a Teams chat to be message to be sent. I think I just have to always remind myself to extend myself grace, to be patient with myself. I definitely aim to be patient with other people, and I'm always reminding people it's okay, but I don't always do that for myself. So it makes me think about the example that you just shared, or the reference you just made about lead by example. I will extend grace to others quicker than I extend grace to myself, which will totally stress some people out, but
Yeah.
that's my truth. I'm being honest.
Hey, I get it. I get it. I mean, we're all human, right? And I think that is probably one of the other things to really kind of take into accountability. Like, I think as not being so quick towards a punitive response, right, I think is also ultimately the most important way of really kind of creating that psychological safety. Like, let's start with some understanding first. Like, how did we get here versus the reaction to just point fingers and, assign blame, but really try to understand how did we get here, right? And I think that that can be a really helpful way for leaders in particular to really kind of show up in that manner.
Accountability is key in regards to understanding how to manage it, which goes back to the grace, and also it goes to what you were just sharing in regards to understanding your boundaries. Like, what can you handle in a day? What can you handle sometimes in a 5-minute period?
Yep.
And what does that look like, right? And I think just have to be mindful of that. And in the project management world, we're always pivoting. But I think sometimes we forget that that's a part of our culture, right? It's a part of our culture to pivot. It's a part of our culture to take a step back and assess. It's a part of our culture to just, hey, let's loop back around and have another conversation. And even though that's part of our culture, sometimes we forget that, and we have this bar so high that it can just almost be devastating to the progress that you've made for the program or project that you're leading, because you're not functioning in a place of safety psychologically for not only yourself, but for your team, because that recognition of culture is not being made.
Yeah, like there are always going to be some aspects of every organization's culture that are going to be automatically kind of built in to how each organization approaches their psychological safety, right? The psychological safety that I'm probably going to experience on a team of other therapists, right, is going to be probably very, very different than the way that we would approach psychological safety if I was in a room of lawyers or engineers or physicians or project managers, right? So I think taking your culture into account is necessary, and it doesn't always have to look how another team does it, because it won't, because every team is going to be different based off of everybody's individual needs, everybody's personalities. But I think allowing people to know that the first step is never automatically going to be punitive, but supportive, is really going to be the way to set that tone. And for people to consistently see that be the way that people lead, people will gradually feel more and more comfortable in the spaces.
For sure. Are there any tools or frameworks that you recommend that project managers, leaders implement or try?
I think I statements are great, right? So let's start off with, I feel blah, 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 right? Rather than starting off with how somebody else is presenting, that automatically leaves people feeling pretty defensive, so they don't end up hearing the rest of your sentence. Let's starting off with things that are way more positive than anything else. Celebrating wins, right? But when you're doing that, making sure you're celebrating the win and that's it, not adding a but ... because then it almost kind of negates the previous sentence, right? We got to be intentional about that. Active listening seems basic, but people don't tend to actually listen to what other people are saying. People listen to respond, not listen to understand. And so if you start off with listening to understand, then you're more curious and you ask more questions. That lets people know that you're really engaged in what they have to say, and you're actually trying to connect with them rather than just checking something off of a box and saying, okay, well, I did it and I asked them that question, so now let's move on. People want to feel like the engagement is genuine, right? And so eye contact, nonverbal communication, right? Like, what is your body posture? How are you positioning yourself? Things of that nature, even when you're on Zoom. I think those kind of things really come into play.
No, thank you for those shares. Those are very insightful. So for the PMs that are catching the replay, watching now with us, what is your suggestions for them to manage their own mental wellness while promoting the safety of others, psychological safety of others?
For, I mean, is I think everybody has the capabilities to show up more authentically, right? And I think if people begin to really be first honest with themselves and authentic with themselves and kind of are more in tune with where they're at when they're starting and where they are, I think it makes it so much easier for that to be modeled and mirrored by the rest of the team, right? So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the other project managers and everyone who's going to be catching the replay can really add to this conversation and, you know, share some more of their own insights and maybe their own experiences. Because that's how we all learn, right? Just sharing more of our own kind of what's worked and what hasn't worked, right? And then people can really kind of build off of that. So really looking forward to seeing the comments for everybody who catches the replay.
That's awesome. Thank you, Val, for another mid-month check-in. Do you have any final thoughts or shares that you want the project and program management professionals to be mindful of for the rest of this month?
Yeah, you know, we're in month one, quarter one, right? There's a lot of 2025 to work towards. So guys, just be gracious to yourselves. It all will not be accomplished this month. So give yourself some grace, listen to your bodies, right? And be real and be honest with yourselves and what you need. Thank you, Michelle, for having me. I'm looking forward to next month's check-in.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time, and stay safe, stay well, and remember to check in. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night or great week. Great January.
Bye.